The air was thick with the sweet scent of freshly cut grass, and the sound of children laughing echoed in the background. The sun shone down warmly on the playground, casting long shadows as the day began to wind down. David wheeled his daughter, Ella, across the soft grass, the light chatter of parents and the squeal of swings filling the air. It was supposed to be a simple, peaceful day, just a father and his daughter enjoying a rare moment of normalcy. Ella, with her bright eyes and infectious smile, was the light of his life, and in moments like this, he felt like they could be just another family in this perfect little suburban town, free from the chaos that had so often clouded their lives. Ella had a disability, and her wheelchair was something she had grown accustomed to. It wasn't just a piece of equipment, it was her freedom, her way of exploring the world and experiencing the same joy and wonder any child deserved. David had worked tirelessly to make sure Ella had every opportunity, and the playground, this peaceful oasis where she could finally play and feel like a normal child, was one of the few places that gave him a sense of relief. For once, there were no stares, no judgments, just the simple act of enjoying a day in the sun. But as they approached the swings, David's senses went on high alert. He felt it before he saw her. The sound of the harsh, quick click of high heels against the pavement, Megan, the HOA president, the one person David had learned to avoid over the past year. But not today. Today, she was here. She was walking towards them with her clipboard firmly in hand, eyes scanning the playground like a hawk, looking for prey. David could already feel the tension in his chest, a knot he couldn't seem to shake. "Excuse me," Megan called out, her voice piercing through the air, cutting through the peace like a blade. David stiffened, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He glanced down at Ella, who was sitting contentedly in her wheelchair, her small fingers gripping the armrests as she watched the other children play. She had no idea the storm was coming. Megan was already standing in front of them, her stern expression as unwavering as ever. "That wheelchair," she said coldly, her gaze moving over Ella's chair, then locking eyes with David. "It doesn't match the school's theme. It's too bright, too distracting for the children who need to focus." David blinked in disbelief. "What are you talking about?" His voice was calm, but there was a simmering frustration beneath it. "Ella isn't doing anything wrong. She's just here to play like every other kid." But Megan wasn't listening. "The theme for the playground is supposed to be uniform, and your daughter's wheelchair doesn't fit in. It's making the place look unprofessional. You need to remove it immediately." Her voice was firm, authoritative. There was no room for negotiation in her tone. David felt his blood pressure rise. This wasn't just about a wheelchair. It wasn't about the playground. This was about Megan asserting her control over something that didn't belong to her. This was about her need to micromanage every tiny detail of people's lives. And now, she was coming after his daughter, his little girl. He took a deep breath, trying to keep the anger at bay. "It's just a wheelchair, Megan. It's not hurting anyone. Ella's just here to enjoy the day, like every other child on this playground." But Megan wasn't satisfied. She crossed her arms, her gaze never faltering. "You're not listening. This playground has a purpose. It's for kids to play, not for distractions like this. I'm going to need you to take her and leave." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Ella, his daughter, was being told that she didn't belong, that her very existence was somehow ruining the perfection of this suburban dream. And the worst part was, he knew this wasn't an isolated incident. Megan had a history of bullying families in the neighborhood, fixating on the smallest details, from how someone's lawn looked to the way their garbage cans were placed. But this was different. This was about his daughter. His little girl, who had every right to be here, was now being singled out in front of everyone. "Megan, please," David said, his voice tightening with frustration. "She's a child. Just let her be. She's not causing any trouble." He glanced down at Ella, who was now looking up at him, confusion in her eyes. She didn't understand why this woman was speaking to her like this, why she was being told to leave when all she wanted was to play. But Megan's expression didn't change. "If you don't leave right now," she said, pulling out a small handgun from the side of her jacket and pointing to David and Ella, I'll make sure you never come back here again. I don't care what you think about the rules." Her cold eyes locked onto David's, and for the first time, he realized the depths of her madness. Megan wasn't just enforcing rules. She was willing to do anything to maintain her twisted idea of control. The gun gleamed in the sunlight, its cold metal reflecting the horror in David's eyes. His heart stopped, his blood ran cold. Ella, still unaware of the full gravity of the situation, looked up at him with wide eyes. His heart was hammering in his chest, the world around him spinning. But in that moment, as he looked down at his daughter, something inside him snapped. Without thinking, David moved. His protective instinct surged forward. He jumped in front of Ella, pushing her wheelchair back, shielding her with his own body. "You can't do this," he shouted, his voice shaking with rage. But Megan didn't flinch. She kept the gun trained on Ella, the barrel aimed at her fragile, innocent body. "I'm the HOA president," Megan said, her voice ice cold, "and I can make sure you never step foot in this neighborhood again. So move now." It was in that moment, as he stood there protecting his daughter from the woman who had ruined their peace, that David realized just how far he was willing to go to keep his family safe. The stakes were higher than he ever could have imagined, and with Megan standing in front of him, gun in hand, he knew that the battle for his daughter's future for their safety had only just begun. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a soft golden glow across David's front yard, highlighting the neat rows of hedges and perfectly trimmed grass. Maplewood Drive was the kind of street that felt like it had been pulled straight from the pages of a magazine. Every house was immaculately kept, every lawn a vibrant shade of green, and the sidewalks free of cracks or imperfections. It was the epitome of suburban life, the ideal place where young families could raise their children in peace away from the noise and chaos of the outside world. David had always dreamed of this life, an orderly, peaceful existence where he and his daughter, Ella, could enjoy the simple pleasures of life without the worries that plagued so many other families. After years of living in more chaotic environments, they had finally found a place that seemed to promise the tranquility they had been searching for. Ella, who had been born with cerebral palsy, needed a quiet, safe space where she could move through the world with some sense of normalcy. And David, a single father who had raised her alone after his wife passed away during childbirth, was determined to make sure Ella had everything she needed. Each day, in Maplewood followed a familiar routine. David would wake up early before Ella to take a few moments to himself. He brewed a pot of coffee, opened the front door to let in the cool morning air, and sat on the porch steps with a mug in hand. The sound of chirping birds and the occasional hum of a distant lawnmower were the only noises breaking the early morning stillness. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, and that was exactly how he liked it. When Ella woke up, her smile was the first thing that greeted him every day. She was a bright, curious 7-year-old with deep brown eyes that shone with intelligence and a sense of wonder about the world around her. Despite the challenges her disability presented, she never let it hold her back. Her wheelchair was an extension of her, not a limitation. David had installed ramps in their home to make sure she could move from room to room with ease, and the whole house was designed to ensure she had the freedom to explore. Their mornings were filled with small rituals. David would help Ella get dressed, making sure to pick out clothes she felt comfortable in, often choosing bright colors that made her feel more like a part of the world around her rather than an observer. Breakfast was a quiet affair, usually something simple: pancakes, cereal, or scrambled eggs. Ella loved when David made pancakes shaped like animals, and the smile she flashed him after each one made the early mornings worth it. Once breakfast was finished, they would head outside for a short walk around the neighborhood. Ella would wheel herself down the sidewalk, her small hands gripping the sides of her chair as she navigated the path with ease. David would walk beside her, keeping an eye on her as she moved. Maplewood Drive was quiet, with only the occasional car passing by. Most of the neighbors had families, and they would wave as they walked by, offering smiles that hinted at the perfection of their own lives. The neighborhood had an almost oppressive sense of order to it. Each lawn was meticulously maintained, every bush trimmed to perfection, And the houses were all identical in their charming but somewhat sterile uniformity. David couldn't help but feel the pressure of it, sometimes the expectation that everything, from the way the lawn looked to how the house was painted, had to be just so. It wasn't that he minded the beauty of the place, it was more that the perfection felt artificial. There was little room for deviation, and he was keenly aware of how others might view him and Ella. Megan, the HOA president, was the embodiment of this perfection. She had lived in Maplewood for over a decade, and her role as the neighborhood's self-appointed enforcer had earned her both admiration and fear from the other residents. She made sure every single person in the neighborhood adhered to the strict rules of the HOA, rules about the height of grass, the color of flowers, the placement of mailboxes, and more. Any infraction, no matter how small, was met with a fine, or worse, a public reprimand. David had tried to avoid her at all costs, but it was impossible not to notice her presence. She was always hovering, clipboard in hand, scanning the neighborhood for any sign of disorder. Even something as minor as a misplaced trash can or a tree branch that wasn't trimmed properly could set her off, and she had a habit of calling out anyone she deemed unfit to live in the neighborhood, making sure they knew exactly how their actions didn't meet her standards. Despite the seemingly perfect exterior of Maplewood, there was an unspoken tension in the air, one that David could never quite shake. The residents, all outwardly friendly, were bound together by a common goal: to maintain the purity of their neighborhood. And Megan was the enforcer of that purity. In many ways, she had become the neighborhood's ruler, ensuring that everyone followed her vision of perfection, no matter how unreasonable it might be. David had tried to ignore it at first, focusing on Ella and the simple joy they shared in their quiet corner of the world. But he couldn't deny the subtle pressure that came with living in such a controlled environment. Every time Megan walked past his house, clipboard in hand, David felt the weight of her gaze, as if she were silently judging him for not measuring up to her standards. Despite the tension, David tried his best to make the most of the life they had. The first few months in Maplewood had been a dream: quiet walks, friendly neighbors, and a sense of peace that was hard to come by in the busy world. But the longer they stayed, the more David began to realize the subtle cost of that perfection. Megan's hold over the neighborhood was growing stronger, and with each new rule and reprimand, David began to question just how much he could endure. The normalcy of their lives, while comforting, was beginning to feel suffocating. The perfection that surrounded them, the rigid expectations of their neighbors, started to feel less like a blessing and more like a trap. It wasn't just about the HOA anymore. It was about David's growing awareness that he and Ella didn't truly belong in this sterile, perfectly manicured world. They were different, and that difference, he feared, would be their undoing. In the early evenings, when Ella had finished her homework and the sun began to set, David would sit on the porch and watch the neighborhood settle into its quiet routine. He'd often look at Ella, who was seated beside him, and smile, feeling a pang of pride at how far they had come. Despite everything, they had made this life work for them. But the nagging thought in the back of his mind remained: how much longer could they live in Maplewood without becoming just another casualty of its perfect facade? It was clear now. David had to make a choice, whether to stand against the suffocating expectations of the neighborhood or to continue living in peace, afraid of the fallout that would inevitably come when someone like Megan was allowed to maintain her hold on everything. He didn't know it yet, but the peaceful, seemingly perfect world of Maplewood was about to collapse, and his family's fight for survival was just beginning. ChatGPT said. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the playground as the laughter of children filled the air. It was a peaceful scene, one of those rare, calm moments in David's life that he cherished deeply. The past few weeks had been challenging for him and Ella as he navigated the complexities of being a single parent to a child with a disability. But today, they were simply enjoying the warmth of the sun and the laughter that seemed so natural and joyful in a place like this. Ella had been excited to come to the playground, her wheelchair moving effortlessly over the smooth pavement. She loved this time of day when she could watch other children play, feeling a part of the world even if she couldn't always interact with it in the same way. David had always done his best to make Ella feel included, to ensure that her disability wasn't a barrier to experiencing life. He had done everything he could to create a sense of normalcy for her and for himself in this quiet suburban world. But as the sun set on that warm afternoon, it was clear that their sense of peace was about to be shattered. David glanced around, enjoying the sight of Ella happily moving through the playground, looking over at the other children who were running around, playing games and laughing. For the first time in a long time, David felt a sense of relief. He didn't have to worry about the noise of the city or the stress of work. He could just be a father, with his daughter beside him, in a place that was supposed to offer safety and fun for all children. But as David pushed Ella toward the swings, he noticed the sharp sound of high heels clicking on the pavement. It was a sound that he immediately recognized, though it had always annoyed him before. Megan, the president of the Homeowners Association, HOA, was walking toward them with purpose, her clipboard firmly in hand. The moment David saw her approaching, his stomach tightened. He had never been particularly fond of her, but today there was a certain tension in the air, something about the way she was marching toward them that made him uneasy. She had never been one to mind her own business, and he knew from experience that any interaction with her rarely went well. "Excuse me," Megan called out sharply as she came to stop in front of them, her gaze immediately locking onto Ella's wheelchair. David felt a chill run through him as Megan's steely blue eyes scanned Ella's chair. She tilted her head slightly, like a bird of prey studying its next move. "That wheelchair," she began, her tone cold and critical, "it doesn't fit in with the theme of the playground. You're disrupting the aesthetic of the area." David blinked, taken aback by the sudden and wholly unfounded criticism. "What?" he asked, his voice tinged with confusion. "Ella's wheelchair doesn't fit in? What are you talking about?" He glanced down at his daughter, who was gazing up at him with wide eyes, still unaware of the conflict brewing. But Megan wasn't done. The school's theme, the color scheme, the playground's aesthetic, it's all meant to be uniform. Your daughter's wheelchair, with that bright purple and pink design, is too distracting. It's ruining the entire atmosphere. She didn't even bother to look at Ella. Her focus remained entirely on the wheelchair, as though it were an affront to the very fabric of the neighborhood. David was speechless for a moment. He had been expecting a simple hello, or maybe a comment about the weather, but this was something else entirely. David began, struggling to keep his voice steady. "This is a playground, Megan, a place for children to play. Ella is just as entitled to be here as anyone else. There's no aesthetic requirement for kids to be part of a public space." Megan's eyes flicked from David to Ella, and the corner of her mouth twitched into something that barely resembled a smile. "It's about maintaining standards. This is an important part of the neighborhood. We have to make sure everything looks perfect, and frankly, her wheelchair doesn't match the environment." Megan said this as though it were a well-reasoned argument, as if her words made any sense at all. David's anger was starting to rise, but he fought to keep it under control. He had dealt with her before, had seen her rigid need to impose rules, her desire to control even the smallest details in Maplewood, and he knew she wasn't going to back down. He took a deep breath and said as calmly as he could, "Look, Megan, Ella is a child. She's not here to cause trouble or make anyone uncomfortable. She's here to play, just like everyone else. I'm not going to move her because you don't like her wheelchair." Megan's face hardened, and her gaze grew more intense. "I'm sorry, but if you want to use the playground, you'll need to move your daughter's wheelchair out of the theme zone. It's a matter of maintaining order and keeping the community perfect." David's frustration was boiling over now. Megan had no concept of boundaries, no understanding of what it meant to be a parent to a disabled child. It wasn't about maintaining order. It was about her need for control and perfection that excluded people like Ella. David knew this wasn't about the theme or the color scheme. It was about her twisted idea of what a perfect community should look like, and she was willing to push his family aside to achieve it. "Enough, Megan," David said, his voice rising with an edge of anger he could no longer hold back. "Ella deserves to be here just as much as any other kid. She's not hurting anyone. This is a playground, not your personal kingdom." Megan's expression remained unchanged, but her lips pressed together in a thin line, her gaze unyielding. "If you don't move her, I'll have no choice but to report this to the HOA board. You'll be fined for violating community guidelines. We can't have this kind of chaos here." David's blood ran cold. He could feel his chest tightening with frustration. How far was Megan willing to go to maintain her precious idea of perfection? She had already made it clear that she didn't care about Ella or David. She only cared about power. "Megan, stop this," David said, his voice a low growl of warning. "This isn't about rules anymore. You're attacking my daughter for no reason. You've crossed the line." But Megan only stepped forward, her eyes narrowing, as though daring him to challenge her further. "I'm not the one who's out of line, David. You're the one who can't follow the rules. If you don't remove Ella, I will make sure that you're never allowed back here. This neighborhood has standards. You'll learn to respect them." It was at that moment, as Megan loomed over them, her harsh words ringing in his ears, that David realized just how far this woman was willing to go to maintain control. She wasn't going to stop until she had broken him, until he and Ella conformed to her idea of what was acceptable. His blood boiled, but he stayed calm, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet determination. "You've made a mistake, Megan. I'm not going anywhere." The tension between them hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. David knew that he had two choices: to back down and allow Megan to continue her reign of terror, or to stand up to her, no matter what the consequences. The moment of truth was here, and the confrontation was only beginning. David didn't know it yet, but this would be the day everything changed, the day his fight to protect Ella and his family from Megan's tyranny would begin in earnest. The HOA, the rules, the community's expectations, they all felt like a distant memory now. What mattered was his daughter. And he would fight, even if it meant going to war against the very people who claimed to have the best interests of the community at heart. David felt a rising sense of panic that he struggled to control. The situation was escalating, and despite his best efforts to keep calm, the anger simmering just beneath the surface was threatening to boil over. He knew Megan wasn't going to back down. She never did. But even though he had seen this side of her before, the side that made her the tyrant of Maplewood Drive, he never expected her to go this far. Ella, his beautiful, innocent daughter, was sitting right there, caught in the middle of it all. It was one thing to hear about Megan's rules and her obsession with the HOA guidelines, but it was something entirely different to see her wield that power in front of his child, threatening her like this. David could feel his chest tightening, a wave of frustration sweeping over him. He had always prided himself on staying calm in the face of adversity. He had been through enough in his life to know that getting angry, letting your emotions take control, rarely solved anything. But now, as he looked at Megan, the anger threatened to overwhelm him. He wanted to shout, to demand that she back off, to tell her just how much she was destroying his life, his daughter's life, with her ridiculous obsession with control. Ella was just a little girl, and Megan was treating her like some kind of nuisance, something that didn't fit into her perfect little world. But the anger inside of David wasn't the only thing he was fighting. It was the fear, too, the deep, gut-wrenching fear that no matter how hard he fought, no matter how much he stood his ground, he would lose. And the thought of losing Ella, of losing this precious, peaceful life they had fought so hard for, was almost too much to bear. He looked down at Ella, who was still seated in her wheelchair, her small hands trembling slightly on the armrests, her eyes wide with confusion. She didn't understand. She couldn't understand why this woman, who had no right to dictate their lives, was making her feel so small. David could see it in her face, her pure, innocent confusion, and it broke his heart. He didn't want to expose her to this kind of hatred, this kind of cruelty. He had promised himself that he would protect her from the harsh realities of the world as best he could, but in this moment, It seemed like Megan was determined to make sure that Ella's presence, her very existence, was a problem to be dealt with. The weight of it all pressed down on him, and he fought back tears. He couldn't cry. He couldn't show weakness, not now, not in front of Megan, not in front of his daughter. But the truth was, he felt utterly powerless. Megan had all the power in the world right now. She had the authority of the HOA, the backing of the neighborhood's strict rules, and, more than anything, she had the ability to make David feel like an outsider in a place that was supposed to be their sanctuary. The power dynamics were clear. Megan had the upper hand, and David was at her mercy. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as he tried to steady his breathing. There was nothing he could do to change Megan's mind. She wasn't interested in reason. She wasn't interested in compromise. Megan had made up her mind long ago that people like David and Ella didn't belong in her perfect, pristine world. Ella didn't fit her vision of the right kind of child to have in the neighborhood. The image of a perfectly uniform community, free from the imperfections that made people human, was more important to her than the well-being of a little girl. David had never been one to shy away from conflict. He had fought for everything in his life, his career, his home, his family, and he was willing to fight for Ella. But this was different. Megan wasn't just enforcing rules, she was making a statement. She was trying to erase Ella, to make her feel like she didn't belong, like she didn't have the right to exist in a space that was meant to be for everyone. And David knew that if he pushed too hard, if he fought back too much, Megan wouldn't hesitate to retaliate. The HOA had the power to make their lives miserable, fines, threats, and perhaps even more severe actions that he couldn't predict. He didn't want to bring that kind of stress into Ella's life, into their already complicated world. He couldn't risk it, but the thought of letting Megan win, of letting her push his daughter into the shadows, made David sick to his stomach. The internal struggle was tearing him apart. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to stand up, to fight back, to tell Megan exactly what he thought of her, but the consequences of that fight played out in his mind like a movie, one in which Ella was the one who paid the price. David's eyes flicked back to Megan, who was still standing there, her expression unyielding. She hadn't softened. She hadn't given an inch. And in that moment, something inside him hardened as well. He had promised Ella that no one would ever make her feel inferior. He had vowed that he would always be the one to protect her, to stand up for her, no matter what. Megan had crossed a line, and David knew he couldn't back down. But the doubt lingered. What if he was wrong? What if standing up to Megan would cost him everything? What if Ella ended up suffering more for his defiance? What if he failed her? The guilt surged, threatening to suffocate him. But David quickly pushed it aside. He couldn't let fear dictate his actions. Ella had every right to be here, every right to enjoy this space without being judged for things she couldn't control. The rules Megan had imposed were suffocating, and David couldn't live under that pressure anymore. He had to find a way to protect Ella, even if it meant facing the full force of Megan's wrath. The moment stretched on, tension thick in the air. David felt as if he were standing on the edge of a precipice, knowing that the decision he was about to make would change everything. He was terrified, but for the first time in a long time, he was more certain than ever of what needed to be done. "I'm not moving," he finally said, his voice low but steady. It wasn't just a statement. It was a declaration. He would protect Ella at all costs. The warm afternoon sunlight was quickly fading, but the heat between David and Megan was only escalating. The air around them seemed to thicken with tension, and every word Megan spoke made the world feel smaller, more suffocating. David tried to keep his emotions in check, but the reality of the situation was becoming too much to ignore. He could feel the weight of his daughter's confused and frightened gaze on him as she sat quietly in her wheelchair, her hands trembling slightly on the armrests. "Megan, please," David said, his voice trembling with barely contained anger. "This isn't about the playground theme. It's about you bullying my daughter. She's here to play like every other kid." Megan didn't flinch. Her cold, calculating eyes remained locked on him, her posture as rigid as ever. Her lips curled into a tight, unpleasant smile. "Oh, I'm not bullying your daughter, David. I'm enforcing the rules that everyone else in this community has to follow. You've let your daughter run wild, and now you're causing a disruption. You're the one who's out of line." Her words stung more than David was prepared for, and he found himself momentarily at a loss for words. The audacity of her statement, the complete disregard for his daughter's humanity, filled him with a white-hot fury. Megan was standing there, coldly justifying her cruelty as if it were something normal, something acceptable. His fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to breathe, to focus. He needed to remain calm, at least for Ella's sake. "Ella is not a disruption," David responded, his voice hardening. He could feel the walls closing in around him, the pressure mounting as Megan's demands grew louder and more unreasonable. "She's a child, Megan. A 7-year-old who just wants to enjoy the playground. And you're making her feel like she doesn't belong." Megan took a step closer, her eyes narrowing, her voice becoming even more insistent. "I don't care if she's a child or not. The playground is a space for all kids, yes, but it's also a space where order must be maintained. Your daughter's wheelchair is a distraction, just like the bright purple and pink colors. It's out of place. It doesn't belong here. You need to get her out of here before things escalate further. For the good of the community." The way she spoke those last words sent a chill through David. For the good of the community. He knew exactly what she meant. To Megan, maintaining the image of the neighborhood, its perfection, was more important than anything else. Even the well-being of a child didn't matter if it threatened the image she had created in her mind. David glanced at Ella, whose eyes had grown wide with confusion and fear. She didn't understand why Megan was being so cruel, why she was demanding that they leave. Ella had been excited to come to the playground, to experience something close to normal. And now, because of Megan, that world was crashing down around her. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't just angry anymore. He was terrified, not for himself, but for Ella. He couldn't let her see him fall apart. Not now, not in front of this woman. He needed to protect her, and the more he tried to defuse the situation, the more Megan dug in her heels. Ella is not a disruption. She is a child, and she deserves to be here, David said, his voice stronger now, fueled by a sense of desperation. You can't just throw her out like she doesn't matter. She's just trying to enjoy a moment here like every other kid. Megan's lips tightened into a thin line as she folded her arms across her chest, her stance unyielding. "You think you can come in here and do whatever you want, that your daughter can be an exception?" she sneered. "Well, that's not how things work. Not in Maplewood. We have rules, and everyone has to follow them, no exceptions. Your daughter doesn't get special treatment just because she's in a wheelchair. She's breaking the rules, and I won't allow that." Her words were like daggers, each one aimed at David's heart, and with each passing second, the situation felt more dangerous. Megan wasn't just arguing anymore. She was actively looking for a way to make his family's life miserable. David realized then that this wasn't about the playground. This wasn't even about the rules. This was about Megan exerting control over him, over Ella, over the very idea of what was acceptable in her view of the world. For a moment, David wondered if there was any way to reason with her, any way to get through to this woman who had clearly made up her mind. But when he looked at Megan, when he saw the coldness in her eyes, the utter lack of empathy, he knew there was no reasoning with her. Megan wasn't interested in compromise. She wasn't interested in fairness. She was interested in power. It was then that David realized he was running out of options. No matter what he said, no matter how many times he tried to reason with her, Megan wasn't going to back down. And the more she pushed, the more he could see Ella's fear growing. His little girl, who just wanted to play, was being caught in the crossfire of a fight she had no part in. She didn't deserve this. "Megan, please," David said, trying one last time to appeal to her. "This is just a playground. Let her be. You're making her feel like she doesn't belong here. You're scaring her." He could hear the desperation creeping into his voice, and he hated it. He hated feeling powerless, but he had to protect Ella. She was everything to him. "Just let us be." But Megan didn't listen. "I'm not asking you to leave, David," she said, her voice becoming colder. "I'm telling you, this behavior can't go on. Your daughter doesn't belong here, not in her wheelchair. She's disrupting the harmony of the community, and I won't stand for it." She took a step closer, her expression hardening, eyes gleaming with a quiet, dangerous resolve. "I'll report you to the HOA. I'll make sure you're fined. And if you refuse to leave, I'll make sure this gets worse for you. Much worse." David felt the heat of anger and frustration coursing through him, but something else was simmering beneath the surface. Fear. Fear that, if he didn't act now, Megan would continue her reign of terror. He was already seeing the cracks in the foundation of the peaceful life he'd worked so hard to build for Ella. What would be next? What would Megan do to his family if he didn't stand up? For the first time, David felt the weight of the battle ahead. There would be no turning back after this. Megan had pushed too far, and now David had no choice but to stand his ground. He would protect Ella no matter the cost. He took a deep breath and turned to Ella, whose eyes were still wide with confusion and fear. He knelt down in front of her, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. "You're okay, sweetie. Don't worry," he said softly, his voice a calm contrast to the storm raging inside him. "Daddy's got this." As David stood up, facing Megan once more, he realized there was no more room for compromise. Megan had made it clear that she wouldn't stop until she had broken him. But he wasn't going to let her. "Not today. Not ever. I won't back down," David said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet fury. "And if you think you can drive us out of here, you're wrong." He stepped forward, standing between Megan and Ella, refusing to let her take another step toward his daughter. "You're the one who's out of line, not us." In that moment, David knew something deep in his bones. This wasn't just about a playground or a wheelchair. It was about Ella's right to exist in this world without fear, without being pushed into the shadows by someone like Megan. And if he had to fight for it, if he had to fight for her, he would. The stakes had never been higher, and he was ready to rise to the challenge. The sun was dipping lower in the sky, casting a soft orange glow over the playground, but the warmth that had once filled the air now felt heavy, suffocating. The sounds of children laughing, the rhythmic creak of the swings, all of it seemed distant, muffled by the thumping of David's own heart in his chest. Every step he took toward Megan felt like a move toward something inevitable, a confrontation he couldn't avoid anymore. He stood firm, his body tense, his eyes fixed on Megan as she towered over him, her presence looming like an unshakable force. Ella was still sitting in her wheelchair, her small hands gripping the armrests tightly, her eyes wide with confusion and growing fear. She didn't understand what was happening. She didn't know why this woman, who had no right to dictate her life, was demanding that she leave the place she had every right to be. David's heart clenched as he watched his daughter's innocent face twisted in confusion, wondering why her world was being turned upside down. "I told you, David," Megan said, her voice clipped, steely. "This is your last warning. Move your daughter out of here now, or I will make sure you regret it. You and your family don't belong in this neighborhood. You're ruining everything." David felt his stomach twist in knots, but he stood his ground. He wasn't going to let her take away the only place Ella could feel safe, not again. His eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched. "I'm not leaving, Megan. Ella has every right to be here. You don't get to decide that for us." A sharp, unnerving silence filled the air as Megan's gaze flickered briefly toward the children still playing in the distance. The look in her eyes told David everything he needed to know. Megan wasn't backing down. She was a woman on a mission, and her need to control, to dominate, was consuming her. She wasn't concerned with Ella, with the life she was threatening to destroy. She was concerned only with her idea of perfection. "You don't understand, do you?" Megan said coldly, her voice rising with barely contained fury. This is bigger than you and your daughter. I've given you every chance to follow the rules. But you've ignored me. And now you're making it worse. You've made me take drastic measures, David. It was then that David saw it, Megan's hand moving, slow and deliberate, to the side of her waist. His stomach lurched, his breath catching in his throat. In that moment, time seemed to stop. Megan pulled out a gun, the metal gleaming in the fading light of the evening. His world seemed to tilt on its axis as the sight of the weapon cut through him like a cold blade. For a split second, he thought he might faint, his mind screaming at him to run to protect Ella. But it was too late. There was nowhere to run. The weapon was already pointed at them. Ella didn't understand what was happening. She didn't know what that cold, metallic object in Megan's hand meant. But David did. And in that moment, he felt the full weight of the terror he had been trying to suppress for weeks. He had fought Megan every step of the way, tried to protect his daughter from her cruel and senseless rules, but now he was facing something far worse. A woman willing to hurt his child just to make a point. Megan, don't do this. David shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. You can't. This isn't you. But Megan wasn't listening. Her eyes were as cold as steel, her grip on the gun steady. You've left me no choice, she said, her voice eerily calm. You and your daughter have disrupted my perfect world, David, and I will do whatever it takes to make sure you leave. I won't let you ruin everything we've worked for. Everything seemed to slow down. David could hear the distant murmur of voices from the playground, the faint sound of children laughing, but none of it registered. All he could hear was his own pulse pounding in his ears and the low, deadly click of Megan's finger tightening on the trigger. Megan, no! David screamed, his voice hoarse with terror. He lunged forward, instinctively throwing himself between Megan and Ella, trying to shield her. But it was too late. The shot rang out, echoing in the quiet evening air like a thunderclap. David felt the shockwave of the gunshot hit him. For a moment, everything froze. His brain couldn't process it. He couldn't move. He couldn't think. And then the world shattered into reality. He turned, his heart in his throat, his body trembling with the cold, sick realization that he had failed. Ella was slumped in her wheelchair, her face pale, eyes wide in confusion and pain, the blood already beginning to soak through her clothes. She was bleeding. She was hurt. David dropped to his knees beside her, his heart stopping in his chest as he reached out, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Ella, he screamed, his voice breaking as he cradled her in his arms. No, no, please stay with me. But Ella didn't respond. Her little body was limp, her breath shallow and uneven. David's hands were slick with her blood as he tried to assess the damage, his mind racing in a frantic blur. His world had come crashing down in an instant, and everything he had tried to protect, everything he had fought for, felt like it was slipping away from his grasp. The chaos erupted around them. People were shouting. Someone was calling 911. David could hear the frantic voices, the sound of footsteps rushing toward him, but it felt distant, like he was underwater. Nothing mattered except Ella, his little girl who was lying there, still and silent in his arms. No, no, no. David whispered, his breath ragged as tears began to blur his vision. He couldn't lose her. He couldn't. With every ounce of strength he had left, he tried to lift Ella from her wheelchair, cradling her in his arms as he ran toward the street, toward safety, toward hope, toward the chance that he could save her. Stay with me, baby, David pleaded, his voice breaking. Please stay with me. Help is coming. You're going to be okay. I won't let anything happen to you. I promise you're going to be okay. The sound of sirens grew louder, but it didn't ease his panic. David felt like he was in a nightmare. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, his fingers desperate to hold onto the tiny, fragile body of his daughter. The only thing in his life that truly mattered. Behind him, he could hear the police arriving, Megan's voice cold and emotionless as she was escorted away in handcuffs. But David didn't care about her anymore. He didn't care about anything except getting Ella the help she needed, getting her back to safety, to health. Please, he whispered, his voice trembling. "Please don't leave me, Ella. I love you. Please don't leave me." The ambulance doors slammed shut behind him as the paramedics began working frantically to stabilize Ella. But even in the frenzy of it all, David couldn't stop thinking about the look on Megan's face, the complete lack of remorse. She had shot his daughter, and for what? Because her wheelchair didn't match the playground's theme? It didn't make sense. None of it did. But in that moment, as he held Ella's fragile body in his arms, the only thing that mattered was that he had to keep fighting. For Ella. For her life. Because nothing would ever be the same again, not after this. The battle had just begun, and David was ready to fight. The sound of Ella's heart monitor beeping steadily was the only thing that seemed real as David sat beside her hospital bed, his hands still trembling, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The sterile, white walls of the hospital room felt suffocating. Everything that had once seemed so clear, so easy, now felt like it was fractured beyond repair. He had never imagined that his quiet, peaceful life, his life with Ella, would spiral into this kind of nightmare. But as he looked at his daughter, still unconscious, connected to tubes and wires, he knew one thing for sure: nothing would ever be the same again. It felt like the world had shifted on its axis, and David was stuck in the aftermath, trying to figure out how to make sense of it all. His daughter had been shot in front of the playground, a place that was supposed to be safe. The terror of that moment still echoed in his chest, the image of Megan standing there with a gun in her hand, cold and unfeeling, as if she had done nothing more than take out the trash. The shock still gripped him like a vice, and the fear that Ella might not recover lingered in his mind, gnawing at him every second. The paramedics had arrived in record time, but despite their swift actions, it felt like an eternity before Ella was safely in the ambulance and on her way to the hospital. David had fought to stay calm, to hold it together, but the fear in his heart was undeniable. The ride to the hospital had been a blur, the sirens wailing in his ears, his fingers clasped tightly around Ella's small hand. He had promised her she would be okay. He had promised to protect her from everything, but in that moment, when it felt like his world was falling apart, he wondered if he had failed. In the hospital waiting room, David sat alone, his mind racing, replaying the horrifying events over and over again. Megan had crossed a line that no one could have predicted. He had known her to be controlling, ruthless in her pursuit of perfection, but this was something far more sinister. It wasn't just about enforcing rules anymore. It was about power, about her unshakable belief that she was above everything and everyone else. She had used her power as the HOA president to terrorize his family, to destroy the peace they had fought so hard to build. And now she had gone too far. David's mind kept flashing back to the moment when Megan had pulled out the gun. He had tried to protect Ella, tried to shield her from the insanity of Megan's world, but it had been too late. She had shot Ella, his daughter, his whole world, and for what? Because her wheelchair didn't match her version of what the playground should look like? Because Ella didn't fit the mold of what Megan considered acceptable? David's chest tightened with rage. The injustice of it all consumed him, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized how twisted Megan's sense of control really was. As the hours passed, the shock began to give way to anger, and then, finally, to a deep gnawing sense of guilt. David had always prided himself on being the protector. He had been Ella's rock, her constant source of stability. But now, he couldn't help but feel like he had failed her. He couldn't stop the rage that surged through him whenever he thought about what Megan had done, and yet a voice inside him told him he should have seen it coming. He should have known that someone like Megan, with her obsessive need for control, wouldn't stop until she had torn their world apart. He couldn't help but think back to all the times he had let it slide, all the times he had brushed off Megan's comments, her stares, her passive-aggressive remarks about Ella's wheelchair. At first, he had assumed she was just another neighbor, another eccentric, controlling person with too much time on her hands. He had never imagined she would go this far. But now that the shooting had happened, now that he could see the extent of Megan's obsession with enforcing her vision of perfection, he realized how much damage had already been done. Megan's reach extended far beyond just the HOA. She had managed to infiltrate their lives, controlling the very neighborhood they had chosen to call home. It wasn't just about the gunshot. It wasn't just about the hospital room where Ella lay fighting for her life. It was about everything that had led up to this. The way Megan had used the HOA to dictate every aspect of people's lives. The way she had created an environment where fear of retribution kept everyone in line. And now, David knew that the neighborhood, the community they had been part of, was complicit in Megan's tyranny. No one had ever dared to speak out against her. No one had ever challenged her authority. But now, there was no turning back. Megan had made her move, and David was not going to let her get away with it. The news of Megan's arrest quickly spread through the neighborhood. Some residents came forward, supporting David, offering their apologies for not speaking out sooner, for not recognizing the extent of Megan's cruelty. Others, however, remained silent, hesitant to believe that the woman who had been their HOA president for so long could possibly be capable of such an atrocity. The division in the neighborhood was palpable, and David could feel the weight of it. He had thought that by living in this quiet suburb, he was offering Ella a safe haven. But now, he realized that safety had always been an illusion. Megan had used her position of power to control everyone in her path, and in doing so, she had created a toxic environment where fear ruled. As David sat in the waiting room, waiting for news on Ella, his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. A nurse entered, her face calm but tinged with concern. David stood up quickly, his heart racing. "How is she?" he asked, his voice tight with emotion. The nurse smiled gently, her eyes kind. "She's stable now. The bullet missed her vital organs, but we're still monitoring her for any complications. It's going to be a long recovery, but she's a fighter." David's breath caught in his throat. A long recovery. Those words rang in his ears, and for the first time since the shooting, he allowed himself to feel the tiniest shred of relief. Ella was going to make it. She was going to recover, though the scars, physical and emotional, would remain. The nightmare wasn't over, but for the first time, David felt like they had a chance. He took a moment to compose himself, wiping the tears from his eyes. As he looked at the nurse, a surge of gratitude filled him. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Thank you for saving her." The nurse nodded, her expression softening. "You're welcome. You're a strong father. She's lucky to have you." But as the nurse left and David returned to his seat, he knew the road ahead was far from easy. The trauma of what had happened to Ella, the damage Megan had done, would linger for a long time. And David knew he couldn't let it end here. He had to ensure Megan was held accountable, that the truth about her cruelty and abuse of power was brought to light. But for now, he could breathe a little easier. Ella was alive, and that was all that mattered. In the days that followed, the neighborhood slowly began to process the fallout from the events. Megan was officially charged with attempted murder, and the investigation into her embezzlement of HOA funds was underway. The community was left in shock, grappling with the realization that the woman they had once trusted had been hiding her dark side all along. It was only when Megan was taken away in handcuffs that the true weight of her actions began to settle in. As David continued to care for Ella, his resolve only grew stronger. Megan might have taken their peace, their safety, and their sense of normalcy, but she would not take Ella's future. And he would make sure that no one ever forgot the price of living under the rule of someone like Megan, someone who valued perfection over humanity. In the end, David knew that this fight wasn't just about Ella's recovery. It was about exposing the dark underbelly of the neighborhood, the hidden dangers of living under the tyranny of the HOA. And David was ready to make sure that no one else would ever have to face what he and Ella had gone through. The aftermath was just beginning, but it was a beginning filled with hope. David had taken the first step toward reclaiming his family's life. and he wouldn't stop until Megan and the tyranny of her HOA were nothing but a dark memory. The sterile walls of the hospital room had become David's world for the past few days. The hum of machines, the soft shuffle of nurses' feet, and the muffled voices in the hallway had been a constant presence in the background. He had barely slept, barely eaten, spending every waking moment by Ella's side. His eyes were tired, heavy, but he didn't care. Every day, Ella's condition improved just a little more, and every day, David felt a small flicker of hope return to his heart. The road ahead was still long. Ella had a long recovery ahead of her, but she was alive, and that he knew was more than he could have hoped for in that first terrifying moment when he had held her in his arms, her life hanging in the balance. Ella had started to move more now, her small fingers curling around David's hand with more strength each time. Her eyes, once clouded with confusion and fear, were becoming brighter, more aware of her surroundings. It wasn't easy. There were moments when she would cry out in pain, or when the look on her face betrayed the fear that still lingered deep inside her. But there were also moments of joy. Her smile, however faint, still reached David's heart, a reminder of the light that she brought into his life every single day. He sat by her bed, watching her sleep, her breathing steady but slow. He had told her 1,000 times that everything would be okay, that she was going to be fine. But now he was starting to believe it himself. He had promised to protect her, to give her a life free from fear and pain. But that promise had been tested in ways he could never have anticipated. Megan had threatened everything David had worked so hard to build. She had tried to take away the safety he had fought for, to tear apart the life he had carefully crafted with Ella, and though David had won the battle to protect her this time, he knew the scars, both physical and emotional, would remain. But in the silence of that hospital room, with the gentle beeping of Ella's heart monitor as the only sound, David realized something. The most important thing was that they were together. He had protected Ella in that moment of crisis, and now, as they moved forward, he had the power to shape their future. The past couldn't be undone. He couldn't erase the trauma Megan had inflicted on them. But David was beginning to understand that healing didn't come from forgetting, it came from finding a way to move forward, even in the face of darkness. As he gently squeezed Ella's hand, she stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. Her eyes, still clouded by the remnants of sleep, met his, and for a moment, everything else faded into the background. There was only David and Ella, the bond between them stronger than anything that could ever come between them. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice still weak, but filled with the warmth he had missed so much during the past few days. It was a sound that made his heart swell with emotion. The words she had spoken seemed simple, but they carried with them a weight of love, of gratitude, and of a trust that David would never take for granted again. "I'm here, Ella," David whispered back, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm always going to be here for you. I promise." For a moment, neither of them spoke, but the silence between them was full of understanding, of a shared knowledge that they had been through something terrible and had come out on the other side stronger, more determined. In the days that followed, the healing began, not just for Ella, but for both of them. The physical recovery was slow, but it was steady. Ella worked hard with the physical therapist, determined to regain the strength she had lost. David stayed with her every step of the way, never leaving her side, never letting her face the challenges alone. They were a team as they had always been, and though the road was long, they had each other. But the emotional healing, for both of them, was more complicated. Ella had been through something unimaginable. The trauma of the shooting, the fear, the pain, the confusion would take time to process. But David was determined to help her face it, to provide a space where she could express herself, where she could feel safe enough to talk about the things that haunted her. One evening, as David sat beside her bed, reading to her from a book she loved, Ella looked up at him with a seriousness in her eyes that he hadn't seen before. "Daddy," she said softly, her voice tinged with vulnerability, "why did that lady hurt me? Why did she want to make me leave the playground?" David felt a lump form in his throat as he set the book down and took her hand gently. He had expected this moment, but it still hit him like a freight train. He wanted to shield her from the pain, wanted to protect her from the harsh reality of what had happened, but he knew that wouldn't help her in the long run. She needed the truth, and she needed to know that he was there to guide her through it every step of the way. "She did something very wrong, Ella," he said softly, carefully choosing his words. "But what she did doesn't have anything to do with you. You didn't do anything wrong. She hurt you because she had her own problems, her own fears. And I know it's confusing. It's hard to understand why people do bad things. But you're not responsible for her actions. None of this was your fault." Ella nodded slowly, her eyes still wide with the confusion of a child who had been thrust into an adult world of cruelty and injustice. But David could see the understanding starting to take root. She was processing it, and in that moment, he knew that together they would heal. They would rebuild their lives. As the days turned into weeks, David and Ella spent more time outside, walking around the neighborhood that had once felt so oppressive. The world around them was the same, but they weren't the same. They had endured something unthinkable, and now they were stronger for it. David didn't have all the answers, and he couldn't undo what had happened, but he could do one thing. He could be there for Ella always. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting the sky in hues of pink and orange, David and Ella stood on their front porch. Ella held onto her wheelchair, her small hands steady and sure. She had regained some of her strength, and although her body still ached from the trauma, there was a spark in her eyes that made David's heart swell with pride. "Are you ready?" David asked, his voice soft. Ella looked up at him, her face breaking into a smile. "I'm ready, Daddy." And with that, David knew that they were ready to face the future together. The darkness they had experienced would never disappear. The scars, both visible and invisible, would remain. But they had each other, and as long as they did, there was hope. David had made a promise to protect Ella, and he would do whatever it took to keep that promise. Together, they had survived the worst, and now they were moving forward, stronger, braver, and more united than ever. The past was a painful memory, but the future was filled with possibilities. And as they stood there on the porch, watching the sun set and feeling the promise of a new day ahead, David couldn't help but believe that no matter what came their way, they would always have each other, and that was enough. Like, comment, and subscribe to HOA Karen Shorts for more heart-stopping, emotional stories that keep you hooked from start to finish. Don't miss out on more powerful, suspenseful tales like this one. Share this video with your friends and family, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss another gripping story from HOA Karen Shorts. Stay tuned for even more shocking and emotional content coming your way.